What's the cringiest example of bum kissing you've seen at work? Part of my job involves delivering children's books to various agencies for distribution. One month, our executive director expressed dissatisfaction with a particular book due to a couple of lines she deemed inappropriate. She instructed me not to deliver them and said she would order new ones. A colleague of mine noticed the books hadn't been delivered and, without understanding the situation, took it upon herself to complete the task. She was trying to impress the executive director by doing so. Unaware of her intentions, I was surprised when she returned and boasted about delivering the books, implying I hadn't done my job. She approached me and loudly stated in the director's hearing that she had delivered the books I hadn't, suggesting she was doing my job on top of her own. I simply responded, "That wasn't a smart move." The executive director was not pleased. She had planned to return those books to order different ones, and they didn't have our logo on them, a detail my colleague would have noticed if she had checked. The director scolded her for overstepping and trying to make me look bad. My colleague's attempt to curry favor backfired, and I was commended for following instructions. In another situation, I had a coworker who was quite unpleasant. She treated those she perceived as lower in the company hierarchy poorly while fawning over those above her. Her daily rudeness and condescension towards me were petty and unfounded. She criticized everything from my lab coat to my jokes, my food choices and even my alma mater. It was clear she had been bullied in the past and was now trying to bully others, but her efforts were clumsy and ineffective. One day, she crossed the line by questioning my qualifications as a chemist because my work didn't involve solvents or extractions. She doubted I could follow a standard operating procedure for pesticides, which was a baseless claim since SOPs are designed to be followed by anyone with the necessary training. After enduring 6 months of her behavior, I decided to report her to HR. My coworker was reprimanded, and the owner of the lab indicated that her actions were grounds for termination, but he chose to keep her on due to an ongoing audit she was managing. At the Christmas party, my boss made a speech that indirectly addressed the issue of belittling a coworker's professional status. Although he didn't name anyone, the message was clear. My coworker left the party soon after the speech. A few weeks later, during the owner's birthday celebration, my coworker wrote an excessively long and overly sentimental message in the birthday card, expressing her desire to continue working with him for years. However, her efforts to cultivate herself were in vain. She was let go that Friday. When your coworker tries to be the office hero by delivering books but ends up with a gone in 60 seconds career move. Story 2. I had a coworker on my marketing team who was a lead designer. He often looked down on junior employees and would try to outdo everyone's stories. For example, if you mentioned staying at a beach hotel over the weekend, he'd claim he stayed in a penthouse at the same beach for a whole week. He also sought out the company of senior staff members, bragging in hopes they'd overhear how great his life was. One day, a VP from our company came to speak with someone near our workspace. The designer asked me about my weekend, then tried to one-up my answer. Realizing the VP wasn't paying attention, he got up, hovered behind the VP, and when the VP made a joke, the designer laughed obnoxiously, startling the VP. The VP gave a small, awkward smile and left. The designer returned to his seat and acted as if he hadn't been interrupted. On another occasion, my boss sent me to buy a birthday card and gift for her boss. The card was standard, but the cake was extravagant, not your typical office birthday cake. I also had to stop by Tiffany's to pick up a bracelet, an expensive gift from my boss to hers. Such lavish gifts were unusual and seemed like obvious attempts at flattery. There was also a guy at work who bought lunch for his direct supervisor every day. When asked why, he replied, "The king's gotta eat," which made everyone around cringe, including his own supervisor. Story 3. In an old sales job, I witnessed a peculiar situation where the usual attempt to impress managers was flipped on its head. This job involved outbound telemarketing, making warm calls to confirm interest in mortgage refinancing before transferring the call to licensed professionals to proceed further. As with any lead-based sales system, the newest leads were typically the most promising. The situation began with one person and escalated when their entire family joined the sales team. Their performance was initially above average and soon became unrealistically towered. Our sales goals were to make 400 to 500 calls daily and transfer 10 interested parties. This family, however, averaged 30 to 40 calls and 28 to 35 transfers daily. We soon discovered that they were manipulating the dialing software to assign themselves only the freshest leads, leaving older leads for everyone else. This gave them a significant advantage, resulting in larger paychecks for them and reduced earnings for the rest of us. A new manager who didn't understand sales took over around this time. He didn't care about the family's misuse of the system because their performance made him look good to upper management. Any attempts to address the issue were either ignored. Going over his head was considered defiance and could lead to termination. Their actions led to a downward spiral for the company. Due to a policy for not meeting quotas, many competent and hardworking salespeople were fired, causing a significant drop in call volume. This resulted in the sales team falling out of contractual compliance with the main company, leading to penalties. Their reputation made it difficult to hire competent new staff, and those who were hired didn't stay too long. Eventually, the office had to close due to the mounting penalties, and even the family lost their jobs. Story 4. A coworker of mine is particularly difficult to deal with due to his behavior. He constantly brags about his work, which is often mediocre, talks incessantly about his wealth, and puts down other team members in an attempt to gain favor with management. His interactions in our team's WhatsApp group are especially cringeworthy as he posts fake and cheesy messages that don't align with his true character. His actions are always aimed at making himself look better at the expense of others. He thought he was a candidate for a duty manager position after a manager left, but he was quickly turned down. One of the night managers even told him directly that no one wanted to work nights with him. In another job, we had an assistant manager who would send out inspirational messages through our group communication app. These messages were things like, "Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great day. Let's come to work with positivity and good energy. Remember, what you put out in the universe is what you get back, so let's spread that positivity and tackle the day with that mindset." Now, the problem was that his personality didn't match these messages. In person, he was relatively laid back, but it was clear he sent these messages to impress the owners. I also had a boss who was into the finer things in life, such as high-quality clothes, expensive drinks and food from around the world, numerous watches, and luxury cars. A coworker of mine, within 2 weeks of starting, bought our boss cufflinks worth hundreds of dollars. Over the course of 2 years, this coworker became known as a yes man, never disagreeing with the boss and even appointing himself as the boss's right-hand man, telling others how to do things because he believed that's what the boss would want. When the position for supervisor officially opened up, my coworker was confident he would get it, telling everyone the boss had promised it to him. However, he didn't know that the boss was leaving and had chosen the current supervisor as his successor, who then picks someone who had only been working there for about 9 months. Unsurprisingly, my coworker had been acting distant towards the new manager and supervisor since then. Yikes, his coworker's idea of team spirit is like a pep rally where he's the only one cheering for himself. Story 5. One of my coworkers is the most difficult person I have ever met. I've worked part-time for the company for 7 years and met hundreds of people, none of whom I disliked. While there were some I wouldn't socialize with outside of work, I got along with everyone else at the office. This young man is on a different level, and I can honestly say I just dislike him. On his first day, he acted as if he owned the place. 2 experienced colleagues were working on a project when he approached and said, "Yeah, good job on this part. This is how I want things done around here." Both men in their 30s and longtime employees just stared at him in disbelief. He frequently refers to himself as the smartest person in the department and boasts about how he'll one day run the place. He believes he's a genius because he finished his bachelor's degree a year early and thinks his degree gives him a perfect understanding of business operations. Despite lecturing everyone on efficiency, he spends about 80% of his shift on his phone or in conversation. Everyone dislikes him, department managers, full-timers, and even vendors from outside the company. People talk negatively about him behind his back, and he seems oblivious to it all. 6 people have reported him to HR, and even our HR representative isn't fond of him. They had a meeting with him, but nothing changed. The reason he can behave this way is because he's friends with the corporate district manager's son. He often shares information about workplace happenings with this individual, and unfortunately, the district manager listens to him despite his lack of actual contribution. I'm just grateful that I'll be leaving this job soon. Story 6. At my previous job, the entire company shifted to working from home and most communication was conducted over Slack. I had a coworker who would log in at 6 a.m. to wish everyone a good morning and then reappear at 11 p.m. to say goodnight, even on his days off. Now, this struck me as odd because he wasn't a manager, supervisor, or lead. It was clear he was just trying to impress the supervisors who seemed to appreciate it, but I found it quite unusual. We had several Slack channels where only authorized personnel could send messages or alerts. Yet this coworker would often chime in with the same information as the alerts, as if to assert his authority or show that he had some influence. I asked my manager how he was allowed to do this, and it turned out he wasn't officially permitted, but no one seemed to mind because he was such a psychopath. In another situation, I had a coworker at Target who would go on a power trip whenever he was assigned to guest services. For those unfamiliar, guest services is the area at the front of the store where returns and similar tasks are handled. We all took turns there, often with a manager, and it wasn't particularly special, except that it was slightly more bearable than working a register. However, whenever this coworker was on guest services, he acted as if he were the manager and became incredibly difficult to deal with for the hour he was there. Once, while I was walking to the bathroom, which was past guest services, he went out of his way to loudly inquire about my destination, using that all too familiar managerial tone, as if he were a manager. I simply looked at him and continued on my way. He would do similar things to everyone, and it was incredibly cringeworthy. I'd never seen someone become such a psychopath simply because they were doing a slightly different role for an hour, especially since we all rotated through guest services anyway. Alright, if you're enjoying the video so far and you can totally relate to any one of these stories, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Let's go ahead and get back to the stories. Story 7. A coworker of mine was getting married and often discussed her wedding plans at work. She became particularly close with another coworker who was around the same age, frequently sharing ideas and even referring to her as her work bestie. She often mentioned how much she would have loved to have this coworker at her wedding. However, the bride-to-be eventually explained that there wasn't enough room for her as the guest list had been finalized much earlier. The coworker understood and handled the situation gracefully. It turned out that this coworker had connections with some higher-ups in the office. During a conversation, one of them mentioned that they had met the bride-to-be only twice but had immediately received an invitation to the wedding. When they learned that the coworker who had been so involved in the wedding planning hadn't been invited, they decided they didn't want to attend. They also convinced several other higher-ups who barely knew the bride but had received invitations not to go either. They felt that the bride was using her wedding for networking purposes, and as a result, the bride-to-be gained a reputation as a flatterer. This was especially unusual because we work in a relatively laid-back, white-collar office where aggressive networking isn't even necessary for career success or advancement. Unlike some industries, it's not expected to invite your boss to your wedding. Many people don't invite anyone from work to their weddings, and it's generally not a big deal. Story 8. My former boss was a narcissistic British man who was quite elitist. Our team of 15 decided to get him a group Christmas gift. Despite not liking him, I found a Britannia-themed statue for his office during my lunch break, as he was very proud of his British heritage. I sent a picture of the statue to my manager, who approved it. 2 weeks later, at the gift-giving meeting, he opened the statue and giggled with delight. I didn't claim credit for it, as it was a team gift. My manager then announced she had her own gift for him and placed a large bag in front of him. It contained a Winston Churchill bobblehead, some Cadbury chocolates that were supposedly hand-imported just for him, and a vintage chocolate advent calendar which she noted was his favorite from childhood. She must have spent a lot on these items. However, he just smugly muttered, nice, and pushed it aside. The situation was incredibly cringeworthy and awkward. In another story, I was a branch manager and we had a new worker who I initially thought was cool. We shared the same favorite things, from movies and music to TV shows. He seemed to follow my lead in many ways, though he wasn't a complete yes man since he occasionally disagreed with me. One day, his behavior became just too much. He jumped into a conversation as if he had heard the whole thing, but I called him out on it and he was caught. Then he had the audacity to suggest we do some wild things. I felt bad, but I ended up telling him off, saying I didn't want to do any of those things. Later, an employee played a prank, and that seemed to be the last straw for him. He put a hole in the wall. In the end, things worked out okay. I got a job at a different place, and I think he became a viral sensation on YouTube or something. Story 9. I worked at a zoo kitchen as a bartender and ice cream vendor. The chef could be quite dictatorial at times. I think he had frustrated ambitions of becoming a TV chef and wanted to emulate the tough hosts on the Food Network. Occasionally, he was okay to work with. I discovered that he had a sense of humor reminiscent of like 80s comedians like Bill Murray and Chevy Chase, and joking with him helped to lighten his mood. My interactions with him were very minimal. He was very demanding too with the kitchen staff, but some who aspired to culinary careers would try to impress him, always addressing him as chef. I simply called him by his first name. His main protege was particularly fawning, always calling him chef. When the stress of a big zoo banquet got to him, he just lashed out at the staff for small mistakes. The protege panicked, thinking he was going to be fired and trying to incite a walkout among the staff. However, the rest of the staff, with families and bills to consider, ignored him. It seemed that the flattery had gone to his head. After I got a concussion while cleaning cabinets, the chef became upset with me. I quit and advised him to treat his staff better. I never returned as my doctor told me to rest. In another story, a girl my age was desperate to advance in sales. She lived with her equally educated boyfriend, but when asked about him, she gave vague answers, giving the impression that he wasn't contributing much to their relationship. She began dressing like the president of sales and followed her around constantly. She would gather gossip and relay it back. Her flattery was quite average. The odd thing was that the sales president had dietary restrictions and was obsessed with healthy eating, being very thin and rarely eating. The president would comment on people's food when entering the kitchen, which was awkward. The sales girl started eating only veggie sticks and suddenly claimed a gluten allergy. It was a company primarily run by women in an interior design related field, and our meetings often included donuts and cake. The sales president would compliment the food but never eat any of it. Everyone got the hint and also refrained from eating. I grew tired of this and once cut a large piece of cake in front of everyone and ate it during the meeting. The sales president and the sales girl looked at me as if I had broken a major unspoken rule, as if I hadn't read the room correctly. I was laid off a year later, and the sales girl is now second in command there after 5 years. I have a much better job now where no one cares if you don't have a work-sponsored eating illness. Story 10. I work for a man who owns several businesses, including hotels and event halls. Due to an outbreak, one of his restaurants serves as a canteen for all his employees, preparing a single meal each day. This Monday, I went to the restaurant and ran into my boss on the way. We decided to have lunch together. Upon entering the restaurant, my boss asked the chef about the menu. The chef told him what was available and then offered, "But if you don't like it, I can make you something else." Initially, I didn't think much of it, as my boss has earned a lot of respect, especially for how he handled the outbreak situation. He didn't lay off any employees, even though the event halls and restaurants have been closed for over a year. Not a single person was let go, whether they were part-time, full-time, or temporary help. My boss told the chef that he was fine with the menu and didn't need anything special. The chef insisted, "Are you sure? I can prepare something for you. It's really no problem." My boss replied, "Really? It's okay. I'll eat what we have." We received our plates and sat down. Not even 5 minutes later, the chef came to our table with a plate loaded with 6 different types of meat, vegetables, and fries, enough food for 3 to 4 servings. My boss looked at him, then at the plate, and simply said, "Okay, just leave it here then." The moment my boss finished his lunch, the chef rushed over to take his plate back to the kitchen. He returned with coffee, but only 1 cup. When my boss asked for a second cup, the chef gave me a harsh look but brought it anyway. Soon after the coffee, he brought a dessert for our boss, again ignoring me. Our boss asked him to bring a second dessert, as it would be rude not to include me, but I declined, saying I was already full. The entire situation was quite uncomfortable for me. The chef went to great lengths to please our boss, who had not asked for any special treatment, and he seemed to harbor a deep resentment towards me just for sitting at the same table. Alright, so if you liked any of these stories and could relate to any single one of them, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video, and thanks for hanging with me on this one.